Standing outside the courthouse steps, clutching a crumpled envelope that would change everything, I never imagined that my grandfather's final words would expose the truth my parents had been hiding for 3 years. What the judge read aloud that day didn't just give me back my inheritance, it revealed a family secret that made me question everything I thought I knew about the people who raised me. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The first time I saw the Victorian house on Maple Street, I was 7 years old, and my grandfather, Theodore Teddy Mitchell, was teaching me how to plant tomatoes in the backyard garden. The house stood like a gentle giant, with its wraparound porch and forest green shutters, surrounded by the kind of mature oak trees that take decades to grow. Grandpa Teddy had bought it in 1962, fresh out of the military, with dreams of filling every room with family. "One day, kiddo, this will all be yours," he'd say, ruffling my hair as we worked in the dirt together. Every brick, every floorboard, every secret hiding spot. He'd wink at that last part, and I'd spend hours searching for those mysterious hiding places, finding loose boards in the attic and hollow spaces behind the old radiators. My parents, David and Margaret Mitchell, never seemed to share Grandpa's enthusiasm for the old house. They lived in their modern suburban home across town, all clean lines and granite countertops, while Grandpa Teddy remained in his Victorian treasure with its creaking floors and temperamental plumbing. During Sunday dinners, I'd catch my mother rolling her eyes when Grandpa talked about the house's history, or my father checking his phone when the conversation turned to the antique furniture that came with the property. But for me, that house was magic. Every summer, I'd spend weeks there, learning about the underground railroad tunnel that supposedly ran beneath the basement, hearing stories about the traveling salesman who'd once lived in the third-floor room, and helping Grandpa maintain his prized rose garden that he'd been cultivating for over 40 years. The house held mysteries in every corner, from the stained glass window on the landing that cast rainbow shadows at sunset, to the built-in bookshelf that Grandpa swore contained first-edition novels worth more than most people's cars. When I turned 16, Grandpa Teddy made it official. He called me into his study one evening, the same room where he kept his military medals and his collection of vintage fountain pens, and showed me a document. It was his will, and there, in black and white, was my name next to the property deed. "Emily Rose Mitchell," he read aloud, pointing to the line with his weathered finger. "You're getting this house, sweetheart. Not because I love you more than anyone else, but because you're the only one who truly sees it for what it is. Your parents, bless them, they see maintenance costs and old pipes. You see home." I was speechless. At 16, inheriting a house seemed both thrilling and terrifying. Grandpa must have seen the worry in my eyes, because he leaned back in his leather chair and smiled that crooked smile that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "Don't you worry about being ready for it, kiddo. I'm not going anywhere for a long while yet, but when that time comes, you'll know what to do with this place. You'll keep its stories alive." 2 years later, during my senior year of high school, Grandpa Teddy had his first heart attack. It was mild, the doctors said, but it changed something in him. He became more insistent about family dinners, more particular about maintaining the house's historical details, and more secretive about his legal affairs. I'd often find him in his study late at night, writing letters by hand with one of his vintage pens, the desk lamp casting long shadows across his concentrated face. My parents began visiting more frequently, which should have been a good thing, but something felt off about their sudden interest. They'd whisper in corners and fall silent when I entered rooms. My mother started making comments about how much work the old house needed, while my father would walk around with a contractor's eye, pointing out foundation issues and outdated electrical systems. "Emily, you have to understand," my mother said one afternoon as we sat on the front porch swing. "This house is going to be a tremendous burden. The taxes alone will eat up any money you might have for college or starting your career. Maybe it would be better if we handled the property when the time comes." But Grandpa Teddy was adamant. During one particularly tense Sunday dinner, he slammed his fork down and looked directly at my parents. "That house is Emily's. It's been decided, it's been documented, and it's not changing. She understands what this place means, in ways that apparently skip generations." My father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. My mother just smiled, that tight smile she used when she was angry but trying to hide it. The second heart attack came during my freshman year of college. I was 3 hours away, studying at State University, when my father called. This one was serious, he said. I needed to come home immediately. I found Grandpa Teddy in the cardiac intensive care unit, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical precision. But his eyes were still sharp, still full of that mischievous intelligence that had made him such a wonderful storyteller. "Come here, kiddo," he whispered when he saw me. I pulled a chair close to his bed and he gripped my hand with surprising strength. "I need you to remember something important. There are things in this world that aren't always what they appear to be. People, documents, even the most official-looking papers. Always dig deeper, Emily. Always ask questions." He paused. His breathing labored, but his grip on my hand never loosened. "Promise me you'll fight for what's rightfully yours. Promise me you won't let anyone convince you that you're not worthy of your inheritance." I promised, not fully understanding why he seemed so worried. After all, everything was documented. The will was clear. What could possibly go wrong? Grandpa Teddy died 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning when the October light was streaming through the hospital window, painting golden rectangles on the white sheets. I held his hand as he passed, and his final words were about the house. "Take care of our stories, kiddo." The funeral was beautiful, held in the Methodist church where Grandpa had been a member for 30 years. The entire neighborhood came to pay their respects, and person after person shared memories of his kindness, his quick wit, and his legendary tomato garden. But what I remember most about that day was the way my parents kept checking their phones and whispering to each other during the reception. A week after the funeral, my parents asked me to meet them for dinner at Romano's, a quiet Italian restaurant where we'd celebrated family milestones for years. I assumed we'd be discussing funeral arrangements, memorial donations, or perhaps when I could start going through Grandpa's belongings. Instead, my father cleared his throat and pulled out a folder. "Emily, we need to talk about the house," he began, his voice taking on that tone he used for serious business discussions. "We've had it appraised, and frankly, the situation is more complicated than your grandfather let on." My mother nodded, reaching across the table to pat my hand. "Sweetheart, the property taxes are in arrears. There are significant structural issues that need immediate attention. The roof needs to be completely replaced, and there's possible foundation damage from that oak tree near the back corner." I stared at them, trying to process what they were telling me. But Grandpa always kept up with everything. He was meticulous about maintenance. My father sighed, opening the folder to reveal official-looking documents. "Emily, your grandfather was getting older. Sometimes people make mistakes, or they don't see problems that are right in front of them. We've been in touch with a real estate attorney, and the best option for everyone involved is to sell the property quickly." "Sell it?" The words felt foreign in my mouth. "But it's mine. Grandpa left it to me." "Technically, yes," my mother said carefully. "But you're still in college, you don't have the resources to handle this kind of responsibility, and frankly, keeping the house would be financial suicide for our family." They had it all worked out. A buyer who specialized in historic properties had already made an offer, a generous one, they assured me. The money would be put into a trust fund for my education and future needs. I'd be free to focus on my studies without worrying about property taxes, maintenance costs, or the dozen other responsibilities that come with owning a century-old house. It made sense, it was practical, it was exactly the kind of logical decision that adults make when they're looking out for a young person's best interests. But it felt like betrayal. "I need time to think," I told them. "Of course," my father said, but there was something in his tone that suggested time was a luxury we didn't have. "Just remember, sweetheart, the offer won't stay on the table forever, and the longer we wait, the more expensive the carrying costs become." I drove to the house that night, using the spare key Grandpa had given me years earlier. The Victorian stood silhouettely against the star-filled sky, its windows dark and empty. I sat on the front porch swing, the same one where my mother had warned me about the burden of ownership, and tried to imagine strangers living in those rooms, sleeping in Grandpa's bedroom, cooking in the kitchen where we'd made countless Christmas cookies. The night air carried the scent of his rose garden, still blooming despite everything, and I could almost hear his voice telling me to dig deeper, to ask questions, to fight for what was rightfully mine. But I was 19 years old, 3 hours away from home, with no legal knowledge and no financial resources. My parents were educated, well-connected adults who understood real estate and inheritance law. Who was I to argue with their expertise? 3 months later, they sold the house. The new owners moved into Grandpa's house on a Thursday in March. I watched from my car parked across the street as strangers carried unfamiliar furniture through the front door that had welcomed me for over a decade. The Hendersons, my parents had told me, a young couple with twin toddlers who appreciated the historical character of the property. What they didn't tell me was that the Hendersons had paid nearly twice what my parents claimed the house was worth. I discovered this by accident 3 weeks later when I ran into Mrs. Patterson, Grandpa's elderly neighbor who had lived next door for 40 years. She cornered me outside the grocery store, her sharp eyes filled with concern and curiosity. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Emily dear, I hope you don't mind me asking, but I was so surprised when your parents told me you decided to sell Theodore's house. That man talked about leaving it to you for years. And the price those young folks paid, goodness, your grandfather would have been thrilled to know the property had appreciated so much. My stomach dropped. What do you mean about the price? Mrs. Patterson lowered her voice, glancing around as if sharing state secrets. Well, I shouldn't gossip about people's private business, but the Hendersons mentioned they felt lucky to get such a beautiful property for only $450,000. In today's market, with all the historical features and that gorgeous garden, they said it was practically a steal. $450,000. My parents had told me the house sold for $240,000, barely enough to cover the supposed debts and repairs, with maybe $20,000 left over for my college fund. I drove home in a daze, Mrs. Patterson's words echoing in my mind. When I confronted my parents that evening, they had explanations for everything. Real estate transactions involved multiple fees, they said. Attorney costs, inspection fees, emergency repairs that had to be completed before closing. The numbers were complicated, they assured me, but everything had been handled properly and legally. You have to trust us, Emily, my mother said, using that patient tone she employed when she thought I was being unreasonable. We've been handling complex financial matters for decades. These transactions aren't as straightforward as you might think. But Grandpa's voice kept whispering in my memory, always dig deeper, always ask questions. I started making phone calls. The real estate attorney they'd mentioned didn't exist, at least, not with the name they'd given me. The inspection company had no record of working on the Maple Street property. The emergency repairs they described had never been documented with the city's building department. Each dead end felt like another piece of my grandfather's legacy slipping away. But it also strengthened my resolve to understand what had really happened. During spring break, I decided to approach the Hendersons directly. I knocked on the front door of what had once been my second home, my heart pounding as I heard footsteps on the familiar creaking floorboards inside. Jennifer Henderson answered, a petite blonde woman about my mother's age, with paint stains on her fingers and curiosity in her expression. When I introduced myself as Theodore Mitchell's granddaughter, her face lit up with genuine warmth. Oh my goodness, you're Emily, come in, please come in. We've heard so much about you from the neighbors. Your grandfather sounds like he was an amazing man. She led me through the front hallway, past the stained glass window that still cast those rainbow shadows I remembered, into the living room where the Hendersons had arranged modern furniture around Grandpa's original stone fireplace. The space looked different, but not wrong, like the house was adapting to new stories while keeping its old character intact. I hope you don't mind me asking, I began carefully, but I'm trying to understand some details about the sale. My parents handled everything while I was away at college, and there are some things that don't quite add up. Jennifer's expression shifted slightly, becoming more cautious. What kind of details? Well, for instance, were there any major structural problems? Any foundation issues or roof damage that required immediate attention? She shook her head slowly. No, not at all. Actually, that was one of the things that attracted us to the property. The inspection showed that your grandfather had maintained everything beautifully. The roof was only 5 years old, and the foundation was solid as a rock. Our inspector said it was one of the best-maintained historical properties he'd seen. The room seemed to spin slightly. What about property taxes? Were there any arrears or outstanding debts? The taxes were completely current, Jennifer said, looking increasingly uncomfortable. In fact, your grandfather had prepaid them through the end of this year. Emily, is everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. I felt like I had. Everything my parents had told me about the house's condition had been a lie. Jennifer must have sensed my distress because she invited me to stay for coffee. As we sat in the kitchen, Grandpa's kitchen, with its vintage fixtures and hand-painted cabinets, she shared more details about the purchase. They'd bought the house through a private sale, she said, working directly with my parents' attorney. The transaction had been remarkably smooth, with no complications or delays. Your parents seemed eager to close quickly, she mentioned as she poured coffee into mismatched mugs that I recognized from my childhood visits. They said you were busy with college and wanted to avoid the stress of a prolonged sale process. When I asked about the price, Jennifer confirmed what Mrs. Patterson had told me, $450,000. But then she added something that made my blood run cold. Although, to be honest, we would have paid more. Our real estate agent said the property was priced well below market value. We kept expecting a bidding war. But your parents' attorney said you just wanted a quick, clean sale to a family who would appreciate the house's history. I left the Henderson house feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. My parents hadn't just sold my inheritance. They'd sold it for far less than it was worth, and then lied about the proceeds. The trust fund they'd established contained barely a fraction of what the house had actually been sold for. But where was the rest of the money? That question consumed me for the next several weeks. I started digging through public records, learning about property transfers and deed registrations. I discovered that the sale had been handled by Morrison & Associates, a law firm I'd never heard my parents mention. When I called their offices, I was told that client confidentiality prevented them from discussing the details of the transaction with me, even though I was supposedly the beneficiary. The deeper I dug, the more questions arose. Why hadn't I been required to sign any documents if the house was legally mine? How could my parents have had the authority to sell property that belonged to me? And most importantly, what had really been in Grandpa's will? I realized I had never actually seen the original will, only the copy my parents had shown me. When I requested a copy from the probate court, I was told that Theodore Mitchell's estate had been processed through private administration, with limited public records. By late summer, I was spending more time investigating my grandfather's estate than focusing on my college courses. My grades were suffering, my social life had evaporated, and I was developing a reputation as the girl who was obsessed with some family conspiracy theory. Maybe that's exactly what it was. A conspiracy theory born from grief and disappointment. Maybe my parents really had been trying to protect me from a financial burden I wasn't ready to handle. Maybe the discrepancies I was finding had innocent explanations that I was too inexperienced to understand. But then I found the safety deposit box. It was listed in Grandpa's bank records, which I finally gained access to after months of paperwork and legal wrangling. The box was registered under both his name and mine, with a note indicating that I should have received access immediately upon his death. I had never been told about its existence. The bank manager, a middle-aged man who remembered my grandfather from his weekly visits, was apologetic but confused. "Your parents were here several months ago," he said, pulling up the access log on his computer. "They said you were away at college and that they were handling the estate administration. They provided proper documentation and removed several items from the box." My hands were shaking as he led me to the vault. The safety deposit box was nearly empty. Just a few old photographs, a military medal I didn't recognize, and a sealed envelope with my name written across it in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. Inside the envelope was a letter dated just 2 weeks before his death, along with what appeared to be a second will, one I had never seen before. The letter began with words that made my heart race. "My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, it means that something has gone very wrong with my estate planning, and you've had to fight to discover the truth I tried to protect for you." What followed was 3 pages of revelations that changed everything I thought I knew about my family, my inheritance, and the real reason my parents had been so eager to sell the house on Maple Street. But as I read Grandpa's final message, I realized that uncovering the truth was only the beginning. Getting justice would require a battle I wasn't sure I was prepared to fight. The letter ended with an address I didn't recognize and a phone number for someone named Marcus Webb, along with a final instruction that would eventually lead me to that courthouse steps where everything would finally be revealed. When you're ready to reclaim what's yours, call Marcus. He has everything you'll need to set the record straight. Marcus Webb's office was nothing like the polished law firms I'd imagined. Located above a used bookstore in the historic district, it was a cramped space filled with towers of legal documents, vintage law books, and the lingering smell of coffee that had been reheated too many times. But when Marcus himself greeted me at the door, his firm handshake and direct gaze told me I'd found exactly the right person. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of intense focus that comes from handling cases other attorneys won't touch. What struck me immediately was how he spoke about my grandfather, not as a former client, but as a friend who had trusted him with something precious. Theodore came to see me about 8 months before he died, Marcus explained as we sat in his cluttered office, the afternoon sun filtering through windows that probably hadn't been cleaned in years. He was worried about your parents, increasing interest in his estate. He'd overheard phone conversations, found them going through his papers when they thought he was napping. He suspected they were planning something, but he didn't know exactly what. Marcus pulled out a thick file labeled with my grandfather's name. Your grandfather was a meticulous man, Emily. He documented everything. Every conversation with your parents about the house, every suggestion they made about selling or transferring the property, every time they brought up your supposed inability to handle the responsibility. He opened the file to reveal pages of handwritten notes in Grandpa's careful script, along with photographs, receipts, and what appeared to be recorded conversations transcribed onto legal paper. He installed a recording system in his study after he caught your father going through his desk. Marcus continued. Everything is here. Their plans to convince you the house was worthless, their scheme to pocket the difference between the real sale price and what they told you, even their discussion about how to forge your signature on documents. I stared at the evidence spread across Marcus's desk, feeling a mixture of vindication and heartbreak. Grandpa had known. In his final months, while battling heart disease and facing his own mortality, he'd been protecting me from people I'd trusted without question. But why didn't he confront them directly? I asked. Why all the secrecy? Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression growing somber. Because your parents had convinced everyone, including some of his own doctors, that Theodore was showing signs of cognitive decline. They'd been laying groundwork for months, suggesting to neighbors and family friends that he was becoming forgetful, that his judgment was impaired. If he'd accused them directly, they could have had him declared incompetent and taken control of his estate immediately. The pieces began falling into place. The whispered conversations, the sudden concern about the house's condition, the way they'd rushed to handle everything after his death. It had all been orchestrated. So what's in the real will? I asked, though part of me was afraid to know. Marcus smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. Everything your grandfather promised you, plus quite a bit more. The house, obviously, but also his investment portfolio, a substantial savings account, and some valuable collectibles he'd been acquiring for decades. We're talking about close to $2 million in total assets. $2 million. While I'd been struggling to pay for textbooks and ramen noodles, my parents had stolen an inheritance worth $2 million. There's more, Marcus said, pulling out another folder. Your grandfather suspected that this wasn't their first scheme. He hired a private investigator to look into your parents, finances, and what we found was disturbing. The investigation had revealed a pattern of financial irregularities going back years. My father's construction company had been inflating project costs and skimming money from client accounts. My mother's position as treasurer of several local charities had provided opportunities for embezzlement that she'd apparently taken full advantage of. They'd been living beyond their means for over a decade, financing their lifestyle through elaborate financial fraud. The house sale was supposed to be their way out, Marcus explained. They'd racked up significant debts, and they needed a large cash infusion that couldn't be traced back to their other schemes. Your inheritance was the perfect solution, a legitimate windfall that would solve all their problems. I felt sick. These weren't the parents who had raised me, who had taught me about honesty and integrity, who had worried about my future and wanted the best for me. These were strangers wearing familiar faces, people capable of stealing from their own daughter without a moment's hesitation. "What can we do about it?" I asked. Marcus's expression grew serious. "We can do everything. Your grandfather made sure of that. The real will was properly executed and witnessed. We have documented proof of their fraud. We have recordings of them discussing their plans. We have evidence of the forged documents they used to process the estate. This isn't just grounds for a civil lawsuit. It's criminal fraud on multiple levels." But pursuing justice wouldn't be simple, he warned. My parents had covered their tracks well, using legitimate legal channels wherever possible and relying on their reputations in the community to deflect suspicion. They'd counted on my youth and inexperience to prevent me from questioning their version of events. "They made one crucial mistake, though," Marcus said with satisfaction. "They assumed your grandfather was just a sentimental old man who wouldn't think to protect himself legally. They underestimated both him and you." Over the next several weeks, Marcus and I developed a strategy. Rather than confronting my parents directly, or filing criminal charges immediately, we would challenge the estate proceedings through probate court. This approach would force them to produce their documentation publicly, where it could be examined and compared against the evidence Grandpa had gathered. The plan required patience and nerve. I would have to continue pretending ignorance while Marcus filed the necessary motions and gathered additional evidence. Meanwhile, I would need to be careful not to alert my parents to what I'd discovered. This became increasingly difficult as the fall semester began. My parents called regularly, asking about my classes and my social life, expressing concern about my finances and offering to increase my monthly allowance from the trust fund they'd established. Every conversation felt like a performance, with me playing the role of the grateful daughter who appreciated their sacrifice in handling the complicated estate matters. The hardest part was visiting them for Sunday dinners, sitting at their dining room table and making small talk while knowing what they'd done. They seemed so normal, so concerned about ordinary parental things, my grades, my health, whether I was getting enough sleep. It was surreal to reconcile these caring gestures with the evidence of their betrayal. During one particularly difficult visit, my mother mentioned that she'd driven past the old house recently and was pleased to see how well the Hendersons were maintaining the garden. "I know you loved that place, sweetheart," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "But sometimes letting go of the past is the healthiest thing we can do. Your grandfather would want you focused on your future, not tied down by old memories." I managed to smile and nod, but inside I was screaming. She was using my grandfather's memory to justify stealing from me, twisting his love into a weapon against his own intentions. Marcus filed the probate challenge on a cold Tuesday in November. The legal documents were dense with terminology I didn't understand, but the basic message was clear. Emily Rose Mitchell was contesting the administration of Theodore Mitchell's estate on grounds of fraud, misrepresentation, and breach of fiduciary duty. My parents received the papers on Wednesday. They called me that evening, and for the first time since this all began, I heard genuine panic in their voices. "Emily, honey, we need to talk," my father said, his usual calm authority replaced by barely controlled anxiety. "There's been some kind of legal misunderstanding. Someone has filed ridiculous accusations about Grandpa's estate, and they've named you as the plaintiff." I feigned confusion and concern, asking questions I already knew the answers to, expressing shock that anyone would challenge their handling of the estate. They assured me it was all a mistake, probably the work of some ambulance-chasing attorney who thought he could make money by exploiting grief and family tensions. "We'll get this sorted out quickly," my mother promised. "Our lawyer says these kinds of frivolous challenges happen all the time. Don't let it worry you, sweetheart. Focus on your studies." But I could hear the fear underneath their reassurances. After months of believing they'd successfully covered their tracks, they were suddenly facing the possibility that their carefully constructed lies might unravel. The court date was set for January 15th. Judge Patricia Coleman would hear arguments from both sides and determine whether the estate had been properly administered or whether fraud had occurred. As I hung up the phone after that difficult conversation with my parents, I realized that everything was about to change. In 2 months, the truth would finally come to light. The question was whether I was strong enough to see it through to the end, knowing that victory would mean destroying the only family I had left. The weeks leading up to the court hearing felt like living in 2 different realities. During the day, I attended classes and tried to maintain some semblance of normal college life, but my evenings were consumed by preparation sessions with Marcus, reviewing testimony and examining the mountain of evidence Grandpa had compiled. The most damning pieces weren't just the financial documents, they were the recorded conversations. Listening to my parents' voices plotting to deceive me was like hearing strangers discuss an elaborate heist, except the victim was their own daughter. "She's too trusting," my mother's voice crackled through Marcus's old recording equipment. "She believes everything we tell her about the house being a burden. We just need to keep reinforcing that narrative until the sale goes through." "The girl has no head for business anyway," my father's voice responded. "Better that we handle this properly than let her make mistakes that would cost the family money." Marcus paused the playback and looked at me across his desk. "Are you sure you want to hear the rest of this? Some of what they say gets pretty harsh." I nodded, steeling myself. I needed to understand the full extent of their betrayal, no matter how much it hurt. The recordings revealed a level of calculation that was breathtaking. They had researched property values, consulted with real estate agents about maximizing the sale price, and even discussed which lies would be most effective in convincing me to go along with their plan. They'd practiced their concerned parent routine, rehearsing the exact words they would use to frame the sale as being in my best interest. But perhaps the most shocking revelation was their discussion about my grandfather's mental state. They hadn't just suggested to others that he was becoming forgetful. They had actively worked to undermine his credibility, spreading rumors about his confusion and allegedly erratic behavior. "The old man's getting suspicious," my father's voice said during one particularly chilling conversation. "He asked me directly why we've been so interested in his financial affairs lately. We need to be more careful, maybe start having him see that doctor friend of yours, Margaret. The one who might be willing to document some cognitive concerns." My mother's laugh was cold and calculating. "Dr. Richards owes me favors. I'm sure he could find reasons to question Theodore's mental capacity, if we needed him to." They'd been prepared to have my grandfather declared incompetent if he'd tried to interfere with their plans. The man who had served his country, built a successful career, and maintained his independence well into his 80s. They were willing to destroy his reputation and autonomy for money. Marcus noticed my hands shaking as I absorbed this information. "Emily, we don't have to do this today, we can take a break." "No," I said firmly. "I need to hear everything. I need to understand exactly who they are." The financial investigation had uncovered even more disturbing details. My father's construction fraud went back over 15 years, with a pattern of overcharging clients and using substandard materials while pocketing the difference. My mother had embezzled from 3 different charitable organizations, using her position as treasurer to redirect donations into personal accounts. They were serial criminals who had been masquerading as respectable community members while systematically stealing from anyone who trusted them. I was just their latest victim, albeit the one who stood to provide their biggest payday. How did they think they'd get away with it? I asked Marcus during one of our preparation sessions. "Because they'd been getting away with it for years," he replied. "Small-scale fraud, spread across multiple victims, using their reputation and social connections to deflect suspicion. Your inheritance was supposed to be their retirement plan, one big score that would let them pay off their debts and disappear into comfortable respectability." As January 15th approached, my parents' behavior became increasingly erratic. They called multiple times each day, sometimes to check on my emotional state regarding the legal challenge, other times to share new theories about who might be behind the frivolous lawsuit. They also began reaching out to extended family members, painting themselves as victims of a legal shakedown, and me as a confused young woman who was being manipulated by unscrupulous attorneys. Several cousins and family friends contacted me with concerns about the stress I must be under, suggesting that I should drop the legal action and focus on healing from my grief over Grandpa's death. "Your parents are just devastated," My Aunt Linda told me during a particularly difficult phone call. They sacrificed so much to handle your grandfather's affairs, and now they're being accused of terrible things. Are you sure this lawyer isn't just trying to make money off your family's tragedy? The campaign of manipulation extended beyond family. They had contacted the Hendersons, expressing concern that the legal challenge might somehow affect their ownership of the house. They'd spoken to neighbors, former colleagues, and even some of my college friends, creating a narrative in which they were loving parents being attacked by a greedy legal system. But Marcus had anticipated this strategy. It's exactly what guilty people do, he explained. They try to control the narrative before the facts come out. The more desperate they get, the more mistakes they'll make. One of those mistakes came just a week before the hearing. My father, apparently panicking about the strength of our evidence, attempted to bribe Dr. Richards into providing backdated medical records that would support claims about Grandpa's mental decline. Dr. Richards, however, had principles that my parents had misjudged. He immediately contacted the medical board and filed a report about the attempted fraud. Marcus was ecstatic when he heard about this development. This gives us real-time evidence of their willingness to manufacture false documents, he said. It's not just about what they did to your grandfather's estate. It's about their ongoing pattern of deception. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my dorm room, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the family photographs on my desk. Pictures of Christmas mornings, birthday celebrations, graduation ceremonies. In every image, my parents looked like exactly what I'd always believed them to be: loving, supportive, honest people who wanted the best for their daughter. How do you reconcile that version of reality with recorded evidence of them discussing how to steal your inheritance? How do you sit in a courtroom and listen to a judge examine proof that the people who raised you saw you as nothing more than an easy mark? My phone buzzed with a text message from my mother, "Thinking of you tonight, sweetheart. Whatever happens tomorrow, remember that we love you, and we've always tried to do what's best for our family." Sometimes the legal system gets things wrong, but the truth always comes out in the end. The irony was almost unbearable. She was right about one thing. The truth was about to come out. But it wasn't the truth she wanted revealed. Marcus picked me up early the next morning, and we drove to the courthouse in relative silence. The building was an imposing stone structure that had been dispensing justice in our county for over a century. As we climbed the front steps, Marcus carried 2 briefcases filled with evidence, while I clutched the envelope containing Grandpa's final letter, the one I'd found in the safety deposit box, the one that would soon be read aloud for everyone to hear. Judge Patricia Coleman's courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with dark wood paneling and tall windows that let in the gray January light. My parents were already seated at the defendant's table with their attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Harrison Blake, who specialized in estate law and had a reputation for aggressive defense tactics. When my parents saw me enter with Marcus, their expressions shifted through a range of emotions: surprise, hurt, disappointment, and finally, something that looked like fear. My mother started to stand as if she wanted to come over and speak to me, but their attorney placed a restraining hand on her arm. Judge Coleman took her seat at the bench, a dignified woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and the kind of penetrating gaze that suggested she'd heard every lie and excuse imaginable during her years on the bench. "This is a hearing to determine whether the estate of Theodore Mitchell was properly administered," quote, she began, "or whether fraud occurred in the handling of assets rightfully belonging to the plaintiff, Emily Rose Mitchell. Mr. Webb, you may present your opening statement." As Marcus stood to address the court, I realized that everything I'd learned over the past months was about to become public record. The recordings, the forged documents, the evidence of systematic fraud, it would all be laid out for examination under the unforgiving light of legal scrutiny. But there was one piece of evidence that even Marcus didn't know about yet. Something Grandpa had included in his final letter that would change not just the outcome of this case, but my understanding of why my parents had been so desperate to steal from me in the first place. The truth was even more devastating than I'd imagined. Marcus's opening statement was methodical and devastating. He presented the timeline of events, starting with my grandfather's growing suspicions about my parents' intentions and ending with the fraudulent sale of the house. Each piece of evidence was introduced with clinical precision: the forged documents, the falsified repair estimates, the discrepancy between the actual sale price and what my parents had reported. Your Honor, Marcus concluded, this case represents one of the most calculated and heartless frauds I've encountered in 20 years of practice. The defendants didn't just steal money. They stole a young woman's inheritance, her grandfather's final gift, and they did it while manipulating her grief and trust. Harrison Blake, my parents' attorney, stood for his response with the confidence of someone who specialized in making guilty people appear innocent. He painted a picture of devoted parents who had sacrificed their own time and resources to handle a complicated estate, only to be attacked by an ungrateful daughter who had been manipulated by an opportunistic lawyer. Your Honor, David and Margaret Mitchell are pillars of this community, Blake argued. They handled a difficult situation with care and consideration for their daughter's best interests. The allegations against them are based on misunderstandings and the kind of family tensions that unfortunately arise when money is involved. But his confident demeanor began to crack as Marcus presented the recorded conversations. The courtroom fell silent as my parents' voices filled the space, discussing their plans with cold calculation. I watched their faces as their own words condemned them. My mother's composed mask slipping, my father's hands clenching into fists. She's too trusting, my mother's recorded voice echoed through the courtroom. She believes everything we tell her about the house being a burden. Blake objected repeatedly, claiming the recordings were taken without consent and should be inadmissible. But Judge Coleman overruled him each time. In our state, recording conversations in your own home was perfectly legal, and Grandpa had documented everything meticulously. The financial evidence was equally damning. Marcus presented bank records showing the true sale price of the house, the minimal amount that had been placed in my supposed trust fund, and evidence of where the remainder had gone, directly into my parents' personal accounts used to pay off debts from their other criminal activities. Dr. Richards testified about my father's recent attempt to bribe him for false medical records, providing real-time evidence of their ongoing willingness to commit fraud. His testimony was particularly powerful because he'd known my family for years and had no reason to lie. David Mitchell approached me just last week, Dr. Richards said from the witness stand. He wanted me to create backdated medical records suggesting that Theodore Mitchell had been suffering from dementia. He offered me $5,000 to sign documents I'd never actually prepared. By lunch break, it was clear that my parents' defense was collapsing. Blake huddled with them in the hallway, their whispered conversation growing increasingly heated. I caught fragments. Plea bargain, criminal charges, damage control. When court resumed, Judge Coleman asked if there were any additional pieces of evidence to be presented. Marcus stood and requested permission to read a document that had been found in Theodore Mitchell's safety deposit box, his final letter to his granddaughter. My heart began racing. I'd read the letter dozens of times, but hearing it in open court would make it real in a way that nothing else had. Your Honor, Marcus said, this letter was written by Theodore Mitchell just 2 weeks before his death. It reveals not only his knowledge of his son and daughter-in-law's plans, but also provides crucial context for understanding why they were so desperate to steal from their own daughter. Judge Coleman nodded her approval, and Marcus began to read in a clear, steady voice that carried throughout the silent courtroom. My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, it means that something has gone very wrong with my estate planning, and you've had to fight to discover the truth I tried to protect for you. First, let me tell you how proud I am of the young woman you've become. Your intelligence, your integrity, your determination to always do the right thing. These qualities make you everything I hoped you would be when I used to watch you plant tomatoes in our garden. I am writing this letter because I have discovered that your parents, David and Margaret, have been systematically stealing money from various sources for many years. What they don't know is that I hired a private investigator 6 months ago, when I began to suspect their interest in my estate was not entirely altruistic. The investigation revealed crimes that go far beyond what you might imagine. Your father's construction company has been defrauding clients for over 15 years. Your mother has embezzled approximately $400,000 from the Children's Hospital Charity, the Literacy Foundation, and the Veterans Assistance Fund. They are not the people we believed them to be, Emily. They are criminals who have been hiding behind a facade of respectability while systematically stealing from anyone who trusted them. A gasp went through the courtroom. I turned to look at my parents, and for the first time since this ordeal began, saw my father with tears streaming down his face. My mother sat rigid, staring straight ahead as if she could will herself to disappear. Marcus continued reading, but there is something else you must know, something that explains why they have become so desperate, why they see your inheritance as their salvation rather than simply another opportunity for theft. Emily, your parents are not just criminals, they are in debt to very dangerous people. Your father's gambling addiction, which he has hidden from all of us, has resulted in debts to illegal bookmakers, totaling over $800,000. These are not people who accept late payments or negotiate payment plans. They are people who hurt families when debts are not paid. Your parents see my estate, see your inheritance, as their only way to avoid the consequences of your father's addiction and their years of theft. They are not just stealing from you, my dear. They are using you to save themselves from people who would not hesitate to harm our entire family if those debts are not paid. The courtroom erupted. Blake was on his feet objecting, my father was sobbing openly, and my mother looked like she might faint. Judge Coleman called for order, but the revelations kept coming. I have documented evidence of all of this, Marcus read on. Financial records, photographs, recordings of conversations where your father discusses his gambling debts, and your mother suggests that your inheritance could solve all their problems. I have given all of this evidence to Marcus Webb, along with instructions to contact the FBI if anything happens to me before you reach your 21st birthday. Emily, I want you to understand that I do not hate your parents, despite what they have done. Addiction is a disease, and desperation makes people do terrible things. But I will not allow their mistakes to destroy your future or put you in danger from the people they owe money to. The house on Maple Street represents more than just property or money. It represents security, independence, and the freedom to make your own choices without being burdened by their debts or their crimes. It represents the life I always wanted you to have, free from the shadows that have consumed your parents. There is one final thing you must know. Hidden behind the loose board in the attic, the one you used to search for when you were a child, you will find a metal box containing documents that prove your parents attempted to forge my signature on a new will just 3 weeks before my death. They failed because they did not know about the slight tremor in my left hand that affects my signature, a tremor caused by my heart medication. The forged signatures are steady in a way that mine have not been for months. Fight for what is rightfully yours, my dear Emily. Not because you need the money, though it will provide security, but because allowing criminals to profit from their crimes only encourages more crime. The house, the money, the truth, they all belong to you now. And remember, whenever you walk through that garden we planted together, that love is the only inheritance that truly matters. Everything else is just a way of ensuring that love can continue to grow. All my love always, Grandpa Teddy. P.S. The metal box also contains something else, the deed to a second property in Colorado that I purchased as a wedding gift for you someday. Your parents know nothing about it. It will be yours when you turn 25, but Marcus has the details if you need them sooner. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Coleman stared at the letter in Marcus's hands, then at my parents, then at me. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much human cruelty over the years. Mr. Blake, does your client wish to respond to these allegations? Blake looked defeated. He whispered something to my parents, then stood slowly. Your Honor, in light of the evidence presented, my clients would like to request a recess to consider their options. Motion denied, Judge Coleman said firmly. We will proceed. What followed was a complete breakdown of my parents' facade. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the knowledge that their deepest secrets had been exposed, they finally admitted the truth. Yes, they had forged documents. Yes, they had lied about the house's condition and value. Yes, they had stolen money that rightfully belonged to me. My father, through his tears, admitted to the gambling addiction and the debts to dangerous people. My mother confessed to years of embezzlement from charities, explaining that it had started small, just borrowing money she intended to pay back, but had spiraled out of control as they tried to maintain their lifestyle while covering my father's losses. We never meant for it to go this far, my mother said, her voice barely above a whisper. We just needed enough to pay off the debts and start over. We thought Emily would never have to know. Judge Coleman's response was swift and uncompromising. She voided the fraudulent estate proceedings, ordered the immediate return of all stolen assets, and scheduled a hearing to determine restitution for the charitable organizations my mother had robbed. But more importantly, she ordered that all evidence be forwarded to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. My parents weren't just losing a civil case, they were facing serious jail time. As the gavel fell and court was adjourned, I sat in stunned silence. I had gotten everything I'd fought for: my house, my inheritance, the truth about what had really happened. But the victory felt hollow because it had cost me my family. My parents were led away by bailiffs, and I found myself alone in the courthouse hallway with Marcus. He put a gentle hand on my shoulder and said the words I'd been waiting to hear for over a year. "It's over, Emily. You won." But as I walked down those courthouse steps, clutching the envelope that had contained Grandpa's final letter, I realized that winning and healing were two very different things. The house on Maple Street was mine again. The Hendersons had graciously agreed to sell it back to me at cost when they learned the truth about how they'd acquired it. The garden was still blooming, the hidden spaces were still waiting to be explored, and Grandpa's stories were still embedded in every room. But the family I'd known was gone forever, replaced by the knowledge of who my parents really were and what they'd been willing to do for money. Standing in that garden where Grandpa and I had planted tomatoes so many years ago, I finally understood what he'd meant in his letter. Love was the only inheritance that truly mattered. But sometimes protecting that love meant fighting for the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The house was mine, the money was mine, and the truth was finally mine. But perhaps most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the people we trust most are capable of the deepest betrayals, and sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is the strength to fight for what's rightfully yours, even when that fight breaks your heart. My parents were sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for fraud and embezzlement. The people they owed money to were arrested in a coordinated FBI operation that Marcus helped facilitate, and I learned to call the house on Maple Street home again, carrying forward both Grandpa's stories and the hard-earned wisdom that trust, once broken, can never be fully repaired. But in that garden, surrounded by roses that had survived everything, I finally found peace with the truth that had cost me everything to discover. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.